Well, welcome everybody back to Adoption Happy Hour, and brought to you by NAAP. We are the National Association of Adoptees and Parents, and again is our mission to unify the adoption community, elevate our diverse voices by promoting dialogue, understanding, and healing through education, awareness, and connection. And I'm Greg Gentry, your host. I am a domestic baby scoop era adoptee from California, living now in New England. Really glad to have everybody here. We have a really great presentation here where we'll be talking to Marianne Novy in just a minute. But Beth, can we see the slide for our housekeeping? Yes, thank you. So this is just a reminder to everyone, please remain on mute. Raise your hand either on the screen or virtually when it's time to speak. And you may post or have questions that you can put in the chat. Please use the chat freely. We encourage that. And again, if you're experiencing a serious mental health event or suicidal thoughts, please contact a licensed professional or the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline by dialing 988. And this is a public meeting with no guarantee that information or identity is confidential, and portions of this event are recorded and may be shared in our private happy hour group on Facebook and on our YouTube channel. So Beth, do we have any announcements?
Yes, just 1 second here. Okay, I want to remind you of all of NAAP's programming, or maybe this is an introduction to you if this is your first time being with us, but we have several programs every month. Happy Hour comes to you on the first and the third Friday of each month with a big variety of guests and topics presented, and Greg is our host for that. We also have Putting Yourself Together After Reunion, a reunion support type group that Dr. Joyce McGuire-Pavo hosts for us, and that will be coming up on the 15th. Another one of our groups is First Families, Birth Parents Journeying Together, and that is facilitated by Amy Seek, the second Thursday night of each month, which will make it the 10th of this month, coming up next week. And then our last program each month is facilitated by Dr. Liz DeBetta, Migrating Toward Wholeness, Rewriting Adoption Narratives in the Constellation. And that will be on the 24th of this month. So you can see that most every week there is some kind of programming from NAAP to help us all stay connected. And that's it for me, Greg.
Thank you very much, Beth. So I'd like at this point to introduce our guest. Marianne Novy is Professor Emerita of English, Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies at the University of Pittsburgh. She is a domestic adoptee who met her birth mother in her early 30s and did maintain a relationship with her. Marianne is editor of Imagining Adoption, Essays on Literature and Culture, which was a Choice Outstanding academic title. She is a member of the Pitt Adoption Community for Education. In her career as an English professor at the University of Pittsburgh, she taught some courses on adoption and literature and wrote a book on this topic, which was titled Reading Adoption, Family and Difference in Fiction and Drama. The courses Marianne taught also included Adoption Memoirs, and she eventually wrote a book by that same title, which discusses 45 published memoirs written by adoptees, adoptive parents, and birth mothers, and 2 memoir-like films. Marianne's work in this book shows how adoption memoirs and films recount not only happy moments, but also the lasting pain of relinquishing a child, the racism and trauma that most transracial adoptees experienced, and the unexpected complexities of child rearing that adoptive parents encountered. So Marianne, we're very honored to have you here. So welcome to NAAP Happy Hour.
Well, thanks very much. It's very good to be with all of you. I'm really glad to have the chance to share some of these stories that I found out about as I was doing research for my book. How did I come to write a book about adoption memoirs? When I was 5, my mother told me I was adopted so I could be better taken care of, and I shouldn't talk about it because other people wouldn't understand. And for a long time, I actually didn't talk about it. Pretty much took getting into therapy in my late teens before that started, with 1 or 2 exceptions. But after I came to Pittsburgh to teach English at Pitt, I finally met other adoptees. And after I joined organizations that helped people reconnect and talk about their lives. And after my months of correspondence in my early 30s, I met my birth mother at her home in Wisconsin. We had very little in common, not even appearance, except that we wanted to connect. We did build a relationship. Later, when my teaching and writing, first on Shakespeare, then on women writers, were well underway, I wanted to relate my life as an adoptee to my work teaching and writing. After I started teaching a course on the theme of adoption in literature, I realized that the novels and plays I taught were almost entirely written by people with no experience of adoption. They frequently contained mythic adoption plots, ending with the long-awaited adoption of an abandoned orphan, or a reunion with birth parents reconstituting the original family, or as in Oedipus, a reunion that was a disaster. I wrote a book, Reading Adoption, which discussed how different these plots were from my own story. I read memoirs about adoption. Eventually, they became most of the reading in a few of my classes. I wrote this book because I wanted people to have a more realistic sense of the many different kinds of adoption experience by reading memoirs written by people who lived adoption, birth mothers, adoptive parents, and adoptees. In my background research, I discovered that there are far more domestic adoptions of infants in the United States, between 2 and 20 times more proportionately to population than in any other developed country. This is not just because the first modern adoption law, emphasizing concern for the welfare of infants, was passed in Massachusetts in 1851. It is not just because we in the United States believe in fresh starts and not so much in hereditary privilege. It is also because other developed countries do more federal spending on family benefits, child care, and early childhood education, so that a single mother or a poor couple have more support in raising a child. And it is also because adoption is so widely publicized here as the best solution, the win-win-win, something both political parties and most churches celebrate. In this story, the birth mother is happy to escape stigma and poverty, and the adopted child and parents live happily ever after together. This is the image that the Supreme Court majority relied on in Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization, revoking Roe versus Wade, making abortion more difficult to obtain in the hope of increasing the number of adoptable children. The Dobbs decision claims that a woman who puts her newborn up for adoption today has little reason to fear that the baby will not find a suitable home. But many adoptee memoirists disagree, and a few birth mother memoirists also discover that the adoptive parents were not prepared to deal with racial or health issues. For all the gains that children and adoptive parents may enjoy in adoption, birth mothers experience losses. From the end of World War II until 1973, more than 1.5 million young women in what journalist Gabriel Glaser calls a reproductive and human rights story were funneled into an often coercive system they could neither understand nor resist. The memoirs discussed in my book's first chapter support her view. These birth mothers do not forget relinquishment, but remember it with pain. In later chapters, we see that while some adoptees recall close and happy relationships with their adoptive parents, others do not, or find those good relationships shadowed by racism or by lack of knowledge of their origins. Most memoirs by adoptees describe growing up, searching, meeting, and trying to develop a relationship. What kind of relationship, how it works out, varies a lot. But in the more than 30 published memoirs by adoptees I have discussed, there is only one in which a few exchanges on email end in rejection by the birth mother. That is Lori Jaquila's belief is its own kind of truth, maybe. The memoirs discussed in this book often speak to each other. Adoptive parents often write that they could have used more education or more specific information to prepare them to raise their adopted children, and many adoptees agree. Reading memoirs by adoptees and adoptive parents together demonstrates that some adoptive parents are still practicing the denial that many adoptees' memoirs have been calling out for years, while others, especially concerned about adoptees and birth parents' need for continuity, are changing adoptive practices for the better. This book shows how much some adoptees appreciate parents who encourage discussions of adoption and share what they know about ancestry, and how others feel frustrated by parents who don't. Memoirs by both parents and adoptees show that transracial adoptees experience some isolation and trauma, no matter how sympathetic their parents are. The complications of relationship after reunion is one theme in most of the memoirs by adoptees and birth mothers in my book. For transnational adoptees whose birth parents spoke no English, communication is even more difficult, but it could be very lovely, as Jeong Trenka finds with her Korean mother. Getting past the secrecy imposed by closed records to meet birth parents, however, does not in itself solve the problem of how they and adoptees can get along. Most of these memoirs show that relationships between adoptee and birth family may be rewarding but can take work. They might have ups and downs like a roller coaster, might turn out to be impossible in a few cases, and in a few cases, sound idyllic. A few birth mothers and adoptive parents write about the effect on them of reading memoirs by adoptees. One birth mother notes the adoptive parents' failure to deal with race in their adopted biracial daughter, and that daughter writes a memoir about her birth mother's own racial insensitivity. People in all positions complained about closed state records, the failure of orphanages and agencies to give or share information, and even more cruelty and unethical behavior by doctors and social workers, such as allowing neglect or abuse, representing one child as another, or giving children to parents who are severely depressed or whose childbearing practices are known to be problematic. International adoptees and adoptive parents sometimes discover that birth parents thought to be dead are still alive and believed that what they were signing was permission for a child to be educated elsewhere, who would then return home. This book provides cautionary narratives, pictures of generosity, and stories of mistakes, learning, and forgiveness. The memoirs by birth mothers I discuss all show that they wanted to be in touch with the child they entrusted to adoption. But on the other hand, there are variations in how this relationship develops. There is clearly a happy bond for Carol Schaefer and Janet Mason Ellerby, but for Lorraine Dusky and Jan Waldron it is much more troubled. Margaret Moorman gets only a letter and a photo from her son, but feels good about how his life has turned out. Jan Waldron, having met and developed a complicated relationship with her daughter as a teenager, apologizes and tries for a reconciliation, but it's her daughter who writes that memoir accusing her birth mother of racism that I just mentioned. All these memoirs contrast with the one written by Amy Seek, who chose open adoption and thereby a continuing relationship with the child and the adoptive family from the beginning. Still, this does not solve her emotional difficulties or her son's. I found an even greater variety in the stories that adoptees tell about their relationship with one or more birth parents after their meeting. Usually, the first meeting is not the happy end of the story, as in the myth about reunion. Rather, there is a complicated relationship to be worked out in various ways. Adoptees are delighted to see physical similarities, but only two emphasize that their birth parents have values and ideals they admire and identify with. Nicole Chung, whose scholarly father understands her better than her adoptive parents, and Jaya John, whose mother studied at a seminary when she got pregnant, and whose father is a member of the NAACP and the Florida Human Relations Commission. Jeremy Harding in the UK finds it valuable to lunch with his birth mother across the class divide, observes that her wealth, unlike his, is in extended family and friends, and calls their getting to know each other a second adoption. Some adoptees, like Catherine McKinley, Jean Strauss, Jaya John, conclude their memoirs by affirming an identity synthesizing what they received from all their families. A few choose a side. Biracial Rebecca Carroll, for example, identifies as Black without a close relationship with her Black birth father. There is also much variety in memoirs by adoptive parents. Some emphasize their delight in their children's happiness. Adoptive parents who end their memoir when their children are young are especially likely to focus on how happy the adoption makes them too. Some who take the story further may recount more difficulty and may emphasize learning from mistakes. Emily Prager has to deal with her young daughter's wish for a mother who looks Chinese. Jesse Green with the period of ambiguity, becoming certain that his relationship with Eris and his father is permanent. Douglas Bates, who has adopted 2 Black daughters, must deal with racism in his community, his family, and even himself, but feels triumphant about the racially mixed wedding celebration with which his book ends. Parents who adopt children with a disability, like Michael Doris and Ann Kimball Laux, may have the most difficult path, but Ralph Savarese rejoices in every success that his autistic non-speaking son has. From jumping on a trampoline to writing poetry, eventually graduating with honors and helping to make a film about his life. In these memoirs, I have found moving portrayals of grief, anger, courage, persistence, joy, learning, and forgiveness. I hope that my account of them will help readers understand the complexity of emotions that adoption brings and the complexity of the issues that it can pose. And I hope that my book will give readers suggestions of more books that they can explore. Thank you.
Thank you, Marianne. I certainly heard some very familiar names in the selections that you briefly talked about. I was wondering, for the entire selection process of a book of such a broad scope, what was it like to find the narratives? How did you make a selection of, this is one I have a lot of interest in? Obviously, there are some that are of significance in the sense that they have greater awareness in the community that they're out there. But what was it like to actually pick the memoirs themselves? How does that process work?
Well, I decided that it was going to be only exceptional cases where I would talk about one that was self-published. There are a few that are self-published. For example, one written by a Black adoptee, that's Jaya John, and there's another one written by Black adoptee who is gay, and so there are a few cases where it seemed like the historical importance was such that I should write about them. But there are a lot of self-published memoirs dealing with adoption that I felt that since I had to rule something out, that was a reason to rule many of them out. Also, there were some that seemed to me so full of cruelty by either birth parents or adoptive parents that I just couldn't deal with that over and over again. I included a few in which there was cruelty, but I didn't want to deal with very many like that. So those were, I guess, 2 of the major criteria. And as you can see, I really did want to write about a large number. The number kept increasing as I kept looking for a publisher. So there were a few that I added just fairly recently, and I found them very interesting. So anyway, ordinarily, I think people generally don't write books about 45 other books. There were just so many that I found interesting that I wanted to write about.
And obviously, you wrote from the perspective, I know as an academic, there's, of course, an objectivism, right? Or an objective stance, but you also write as someone who is an adopted person. And I wonder what the range of emotions and thoughts were like going through so many stories and probably relating to a great many. But what was it like, that type of experience going through this exercise?
Well, it was fascinating. I really enjoyed following the stories as people developed them and showing the ways in which their views changed over time, in some cases. It was, I don't feel that that I was torn between being objective and being emotionally involved, because I feel like the cases where I was really annoyed by the adoptive parents' attitude, what my feeling of annoyance was justified. I didn't feel that I was annoyed just because I was an adoptee. I felt that this was because they were insensitive. They didn't understand their children's need for recognition, and that was, objectively, that was a bad thing.
Can I ask specifically real quickly about the adoptive parents book? So I know that the genre here is described as memoir, so I imagine it's all very much story. Did they write, do you think, for helping other adoptive parents? Or I wonder it's interesting that they wrote narratives, and I wonder if in the context of writing a narrative, they were trying to promote something, or you sensed a theme going through these.
Yes, I think, well, the one that fit the description that I just gave of somebody who was not sufficiently recognizing their child's needs. There's really just one that I wrote about that was like that. And she was really, this is called Two Little Girls. And the author's last name is Reid, R-E-I-D. And she was, she did definitely emphasize that she was trying to promote adoption. She was trying to tell people who wanted to adopt that, it's possible. Uh, so yes, I think in other cases, people want to say, this is really difficult. The people who adopted children who were disabled, for example, you really need to be prepared for this. Or people who had not had sufficient understanding of racism before they adopted children of another race. They really wanted to emphasize that people ought to prepare themselves before adopting, and especially in either of those kinds of adoptions, and that it would be difficult. They would need to have help along the way.
And for first parents, I was interested in the fact that you said some of them who wrote along with an adoptee, right? There were some that I think you described that way. I know you described adoptive parents writing with adoptees sometimes, but in the case of first parents who wrote, did they? I'm trying to search for a word here.
Are you
there
talking
a
about
certain?
collaboration? Because I didn't really mention that. I think
Okay,
perhaps you misunderstood me. Yeah.
I probably did then. Sorry about that. The way the books were written, though, I thought I'd heard that there was something in there, and so yeah, let me phrase a different question then, because it's still going to be based on the first parent experience, which is there were those who had not found children yet. There were those who had or had been found, and you mentioned one that was particularly impactful to you. Can you talk about that one again real quickly?
Um, in all the cases of the Birthmother Memoirs that I wrote about, there was some kind of contact with the child that they had given up for adoption. And I think the one that you may be referring to, the one that was the most painful, was Lorraine Dusky's, because
Yeah.
uh, because the relationship with her birth daughter was painful. That daughter had medical and mental and physical problems that were partly related, or perhaps largely related, to the fact that the adoption agency had not passed medical information on to the adoptive parents. Lorraine tried very hard to get that information across. She felt that there was medication that she had taken during pregnancy, for example, that might have a bad impact on the child, and the parents were not told about that. So anyway, the child had many disabilities, and medication that she took gave her more disabilities. They were able to meet, and there were times when they had a good relationship, but ultimately the daughter committed suicide. And this was an extremely painful story. So this is, there were other cases where the reunion was very happy. And one of the clearest examples of that is Janet Mason Ellerby's, that she found that having got connected by a searcher, she found that the daughter that she had given up had actually been adopted by a family that was rather like her own. And they got along extremely well. However, in a sense, it was a irony that her adoptive mother had recently died, and the daughter, had a baby. So, so this meant that she, as a birth mother, was able to fill in for the place of the adoptive mother, in a sense, to some extent, during the time right after childbirth. So this was one of the cases where the reunion, this was Janet Mason Ellerby, where the reunion was very, very joyful and continued to be so. And the other cases, I guess the other one that was really troubled was the one whose daughter wrote the counter argument, in a sense, to her own. That is this was one of those cases where the issue of race was so very important in making the relationship more complicated, and in lots of ways. Margaret Mormon was very happy that she got a letter from her son. She felt that was enough. She could accept that. She could see that he had had a good life, that his parents had treated him well, and she could actually see resemblances to herself in him. So that was, and she, by this point, she had married, and she had a daughter that she kept, and so she did not have so much need to actually meet him in person, as some of the other birth mothers did with their children.
Thank you. And in terms of the filmmaking, not the process, of course, of making films, but there were 2 memoirs that were in the format of films you mentioned. Are there many such films out there like that in this format, or was it difficult to find just a couple?
Well, these came to my attention because they were shown on the program called POV, Point of View, by PBS. And one of them was Deanne Borsche Leem's First Person Plural. She is a terrific filmmaker, and she has made, I think, 3 other films dealing with adoption. She is a Korean adoptee after this one. But this is the one that's the most autobiographical. The others extend to deal with other adoptees and whole groups of Korean adoptees. So anyway, the procedure that she presented in that film of her growing up, the way in which she was impacted by racism, the way in which she had problems with what her parents wanted her to do, but also problems with her just wanting to be white, and obviously was not able to be white. This was something that was experience shared by many other transracial adoptees. And so it had a lot of impact that was shown, I think, in the year 2000. And then that same series, The Point of View on PBS, about 10 years later, showed Off and Running, which was about a Black adoptee that was adopted by a Jewish lesbian couple, and basically was raised to go to Jewish schools until she went to high school, where she went to a Black high school, and the transition was really very difficult for her. So she was the co-script writer of the film. It turned out that the filmmaker was a friend of one of her mothers, I believe, and that's how they got connected. And so she was able to use this film to tell a lot of her story, which is, very, very important about the experience of transracial adoptees. So those two are really standouts, and I quite with quite justification publicized very well. And I never saw another autobiographical documentary about adoption being publicized in that way. It maybe I did not follow film, so maybe there were things that I missed that might have been interesting. But anyway, it was not like there were films that were autobiographical memoirs that I knew about that I decided not to use. Those were the only two that I knew about that.
They sound really compelling, very interesting. And so in total, with all of the work that you put into this, the breadth of the survey of this and the in-depth and out, I don't know if I would call it analysis, but obviously the processing inwardly of everything that you were working through in terms of content here. Were there any themes in there that surprised you, or anything in particular that stands out as something that you were surprised you learned as you went along?
Well, I did find over and over again the fact that parents were not sufficiently prepared. And I didn't really think that I would see that so much, but this is something that parents talked about and that adoptees talked about also. I think another thing that surprised me was that I thought that open adoption would really be helpful. I thought that if you could keep in touch with your birth mother, or maybe even more of the family, if you could keep in touch, then you wouldn't have you wouldn't have the questions. You would know somebody who was more like you, and it could be kind of like an extended family situation. But it's much more difficult than that. I found that out from reading Amy Seek's book, and uh, it may be that it is better than a closed adoption, but nevertheless, there is still this sense of loss and this sense of ambiguity. The birth mother has this in between position, and she feels like she has to censor herself. She has maternal feelings, but she doesn't really have the status of a mother, and so she has to, and many times she has to hide her feelings in some way. So at any rate, I was surprised by that. I really did think that open adoption would be helpful, and I read. Um, well, in addition to Amy Seek's book, I read in another book by the sociologist Gretchen Sisson. I read quotations from birth mothers in open adoption who just found it very painful to be saying goodbye every time they said goodbye. It was painful, and of course they had to say goodbye many, many times.
Imagine. So are there, I know that with open adoption, are there any memoirs at this point that have come out from adoptees from the perspective of open adoption, or is it still that these are fairly young people?
I don't know of any published by an adoptee in an open adoption. I'm sure there will be. There will be
Right.
some, but
So I'm wondering, when we talk about a constellation and a triad, for example, and there are other members in the story here, let's say there are siblings involved, extended family, like you mentioned here.
Mhm.
Did you see anything in any of the works about relationship between adoptees and adoptive siblings that surprised you, or how those relationships worked out?
Well, the one that comes to my mind first is in Jaya John's memoir. He was a Black adoptee, and he did have a Black brother, but he had a white sister who was a little older than he was. And it was surprising to discover that at a certain point, he was more popular than she was because he was such a clown. He was able to do all sorts of things that made people laugh, and she was kind of envious of that. More recently, I read a book, came out too late for me to use and would not have fit into any of my categories, called Skin Folk, which was written by a, the child in the family with lots of adopted children, who was the first one born who was not adopted. And that, again, this was another family that was adopting transracially, with a great sense of trying to bridge the gaps in our country, and not really succeeding. And it turned out there was a lot of hostility focused on his Black brother, and so he had a very difficult life. So that's one of the few cases I know of the sibling actually telling the story.
That, and I hear such a predominant theme of
Mhm.
what happens with the transracial adoptees, and it's such an important subject, and something I think that our growing awareness in the community. I know that people have been writing more and more about it, speaking up more and more about it, and I
Mhm.
feel like the literature is probably going to explode on that as well.
Mhm.
Um, did you have takeaways from that maybe challenged you as somebody who wanted to understand better the experience of transracial adoptees?
Well, I guess basically, um, the main takeaway is that parents need to have more of an education, and that it's really hard to be the only Black face in your class or in many events in your community. That it is now the case that there are some parents who are really willing to move so that they're in a more integrated neighborhood, but that really takes a lot of commitment.
We did have a question here in the chat about, in the case of birth mothers, whether there were instances in any of what you read where someone just felt they couldn't connect with the child, or chose not to. Maybe it was too traumatizing for them. And I know you said that there were certain cases you chose not to read in the literature, but did you read any about that? I think you might have mentioned one where that might have happened.
I'm not sure, because if the birth mother herself felt that way, then she wouldn't write about it. Um,
That
I
makes sense.
believe, yeah. Um, yeah, I mean, yeah, certainly there may well be cases like that, but they didn't write about that as far as I know.
And real quickly, how do you hope that the book will contribute to the overall conversation about adoption?
Well, I really want people to see that the experiences of adoptees are very diverse. And I want people to see that usually the adoptees who get along best with their adoptive parents are the ones whose adoptive parents are most willing to talk about adoption and to talk about their children's ancestry with them, and don't feel threatened by that. I think there are a few other cases where you can say, okay, you look, this is something that the adoptive parents does that is, that really makes things difficult for their son or daughter, and so adoptive parents ought to be able to learn from that. I'm hoping to be able to spread some kind of understanding in that way. And I guess I would hope to be able to spread some sort of understanding, greater understanding between adoptees and birth parents in some way, and looking at how difficult those relationships can be and how people can get through them nevertheless, in some cases at any rate. And in many, a surprising number, I guess I felt that adoption memoirs by adoptees almost always did involve a search. And if they didn't want to search, maybe they didn't want to write about it. I mean, there are a few cases of people who just wanted to say, talk about their other achievements, and didn't want to talk about the search aspect. There's a memoir called something like Dust of the Streets by a Korean adoptee, in which the basic emphasis is on the author's achievement, and there's a very, very small section given to the possibility of, or the meeting with birth relatives. But in most cases, the memoirs do consider this an important issue.
Well, Marianne, thank you very much for outlining for us the content of the book and the sweep of the book. It certainly sounds like a really, really interesting contribution to this, and I hope to take a look at it myself. So, has it been out long? I think it's very recent, right?
Yes, it came out at the end of June. Yeah.
Okay. How has the reception been so far?
Well, I saw 2 very good reviews. I was lucky enough that there was one in the local newspaper of the Post-Gazette. So that was very nice to see that. And the other one was in a literary magazine with the rather odd name of Mom Egg Review. And the author of that, she liked the book a lot, but I don't think that was read very, very, very widely. If any of you are
certainly wish you
reviewers,
success in that.
that's right. Yes.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah.
Oops. I couldn't hear the last thing you said. I'm sorry.
If any of you are reviewers, I would love to have the book reviewed by more people. Okay.
Absolutely. We probably do have some people on here who would do this. Well, it's been a very, very big honor and a pleasure to host you on Adoption Happy Hour. I hope it was a good experience for you also, Marianne. And I wondered if you had any final words for our audience.
Well, I'm very happy. I see Lorraine raising her hand. Yes.
Oh, awesome.
Maybe
So Lorraine, would you like to
unmute.
speak in the recorded portion? Are you okay with doing that? Okay, great. Let's see. Let me have you unmute. Oh, you're still muted though. Fortunately. There you go.
Unmute.
Still, there we go.
There.
Thank you.
Hi. Well, one thing, the reason that I find Marianne's work important is because it will reach other academics. A lot of the memoirs that we write are dismissed because we're just writing about like a journal or something like that. If Marianne becomes an academic who treats the whole subject of what she's writing about seriously, and a lot of academics adopt, and they can influence policy because they also write about it. I met Marianne at a conference that she invited me to in Pittsburgh. And the first thing I did is read from my first memoir, Birthmark, which came out in 1979. And I had not met my daughter yet. And I did not realize it was the opening event with, I think, Jean Strauss, maybe. I'm not sure. And I did not realize that most of the audience at that moment were adoptive mothers, or at least that's the way I felt. And I read from the last section of the book where I don't know my daughter, and I write about, you know, how my whole family is waiting for her. And everybody is like silent because they did not want to hear this, basically, Marianne. That's really how I felt. And I talked to some of the people afterwards, and I was like, whoa, Lorraine, when you go to these conferences, know your audience better. And it was a good experience. And I do remember, I don't know who the academic was who spoke to me and said that she felt, you know, it was God's plan. And it never had occurred to her really that how much that plan included so much pain for other people. And I treasured the fact that she spoke so honestly to me, and I kind of felt, you know, of her as a friend throughout that conference. The other thing I wanted to talk about is that when Marianne talked about my daughter had epilepsy, and it was largely probably because there will never be a study done on taking other mothers and giving them high dose birth control pills and sees what happened. I was told I wasn't pregnant when I was, and it was so early in the game, and that is why I was given birth control pills, and I didn't really know I was pregnant until I was like 4 or 5 months into the pregnancy. And it had a huge impact on my daughter. And it was interesting, Marianne, to hear you talk about the relationship we had, because it was up and down as she describes it. But in my heart, it was basically good and bad. And I remember, of course, the good times and how much we were alike in so many ways. And the suicide came after 26 years of us having a relationship, because I found her when she was 15, and I called her parents, and the first person I spoke to was her mother. And because of her epilepsy, they were already searching for me. So I really wanted to, in all of my writing, the goal was to have an impact to try to change the laws. I mean, I totally agree with what she says about it's not that much easier just because it's an open adoption. And I do know that some mothers, I think of Colin Kaepernick's mother, the football player, she had a relationship with him, and then it's something I think about, he was 7 or 8. She just either she wrote or she wrote me, I can't remember how I found this out, that she just couldn't really deal with it anymore. It was too painful. And I think that is the reason that so many, it isn't all just parents closing up open adoptions. It's often the mother who just, it's just wrenching. And so they wait, and then if they hope for a relationship later. I mean, I don't know if anything has changed, but Kaepernick didn't really want a relationship with her later on. I think he felt abandoned twice, perhaps.
Oh.
Anyway, I see Marianne's book as a great contribution to the literature about adoption, and I was really glad that she was doing it. So, kudos, Marianne.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. That's great. I'm glad you're a member of this organization. I guess you are. Yeah.
Well, how could I not be?
That's right. Yes, yeah.
I don't often come, but I didn't want to miss you.
I'm glad to have you here. Thank you. So we would normally move to the Q&A offline, but if you're comfortable sharing your question online during the recording, that's okay. So you just let me know if you feel okay doing that.
Yeah, I do. Thank you, Greg.
Sure.
I'm Marianne.
Hi.
Hi. I'm Dee McGee, and I put in the chat, I went to Pitt. You probably were there when I was there, and I took a lot of English courses. I spent time on the 5th floor of the cathedral. I was there from 1986 through 1990. And
Yes.
and I think you know Tim Zinkas and Sharon Flake. They were my supervisors and mentors. So
great.
lots of history, lots of kindred spirits there.
Yes.
But I wanted to share that as a fellow adoptee, I went from kindergarten through college, my years at Pitt, and didn't know I was adopted. So imagine, going through my whole
Wow.
life. And then a year after I graduated from Pitt, my adoptive mother's dying, and I find the secret. She's taken this secret to the grave with her.
Oh
And so
my.
it just rocked my world. I was a young woman just starting out in the world, right out of college, and this happened.
Wow.
So I feel
That must have
honored.
been difficult.
Yeah,
Yes,
very
yes.
difficult, very, very difficult. So, but I am a reunion. Met my birth mother. She died in July 2023. And she told me my birth father was one man, but then I found out just 4 years ago it was someone totally different. So through DNA testing, just a lot of
Oh,
surprises throughout my life.
yes.
Yeah. But thank you.
Did you know
It was great.
that Tim Zielkis was adopted and wrote about it recently?
Oh no, I did. I have to reach out to Tim. No,
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Yeah, Tim I was working at the University Relations Department, and he was my Sharon was my immediate supervisor, and Tim was her supervisor.
Yeah.
So I did my internship my senior year at the PR department at Pitt. So
Yeah.
yeah, but spent a lot of time on the 5th floor in the
Oh, yes, I
cathedral.
bet you did, yes. And I was not writing about adoption yet
Okay.
in 1990. Yeah.
Okay. But I'd love to stay in touch with you, Marianne. Maybe I can come be a speaker at one of your groups.
Oh, thank you. Yes,
Yeah.
do. Let's stay in touch. If you're in Pittsburgh, that's great. Yes.
Okay. I'm in Maryland, but it's not far
Oh, I
from
see.
Pittsburgh.
Yeah, it's not too far. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Dee.
You're welcome.
Thank you. So we have a little bit of Q&A going on here. If anyone is comfortable or has a question or a comment, they're again comfortable with it being in the recorded portion of what we're doing here tonight, then absolutely would welcome you to raise your hand and let me know. I'll scan also through and see if I notice anybody who's got a hand up. Right now. Oh, you're on mute again. Let me ask you to unmute. Thanks, Lorraine. Almost. I know it's a pain. There we go.
I actually had a question for Dee. When you did find out you were adopted, did a lot of things make sense that you had questioned, or besides the enormous shock of the whole situation? I mean, one of the things I wrote about in my memoir is finding out, is really nailing down that my grandfather was a sexually abused one of his daughters, one of my aunts. And that then it made sense why my mother and this aunt did not cry at his funeral and had a terrible relationship with him, which I knew nothing about when I was growing up and dealing with him on a not very big level, but now everything made sense. And so how did that affect you? I mean,
yeah, it's definitely.
did you?
Go ahead. Did you have another question?
No, well, can you think of
Okay.
anything in particular that happened to you and you thought, oh God, now this makes sense.
Yeah, when I look back, I realized I only had like one baby picture of me in a high chair, and I was wondering, there's no infant pictures of me, pictures of my mother pregnant, and then I had same race parents, but I thought I was a combination of them, complexion wise. I thought I got my height from my dad. He was 5'10", I was 5'10". My mother was 5'2". So, but I was growing like a weed. I was tall, and some characteristics, that I had that they didn't, I thought was different. But every time I would ask questions like, what was it like the day I was born? Where'd you get my name from? She always had an answer. So I had no reason to be like a PI or investigative journalist trying to research, because you believe what your parents tell you. What they tell you is gold. Like, you have no reason to really doubt. So I just accepted it. But yeah, when I look back, I see a lot of things. Okay, this is why this happened. This is why that happened. It all makes sense now.
Well, I have a question for one person here whose name I recognize, although it's a name that other people have too. Sarah Burns, are you by any chance the person who wrote a review of the film Mother and Child which I quote from.
Yes, indeed, I did. Hi there. How are you? Good to
Hi,
see
hi,
you.
hi. Well, it's nice to find that, because there are quite a few others who are Sarah Burns, but
Yes, there are.
yeah, yes, right, yes.
Yeah. And I recommend that film if you can find it to anyone. It's got 3 vignettes about different adoption experiences. It's a wonderful film. And it was done by Rodrigo Garcia, who is the son of Gabriel Garcia Marquez. So you can kind of imagine, if genes run in families, and I think they do, his writing and filmmaking skills.
Mhm. Mhm.
Thanks, Marianne.
Mhm.
That was great. It's a unique one for me. Someone in the audience who has reviewed, call that. Thank you, Sarah, for being willing to come on and talk about that.
Yes.
That was a good spot, Marianne. You know,
Good, good.
you know your audience here.
Uh-huh.
So I want to again thank you for joining us tonight to come out, everybody, and listen to Marianne's presentation. And Marianne, we wish you all the success with the book, and that it will be widely received and have the impact that you wish for it, and that would be so beneficial for our community. So I think at this point, we will close the recorded session, and then we can see if anybody has any private questions they'd like to ask through Q&A. So hold on, everyone. We're about to wrap up here for NAAP, but please join us again next time for NAAP Happy Hour. We are going to have on the 18th of April, the wonderful Crystal Park, who is actually a documentary filmmaker. And her film was called Because She's Adopted. Great. Thank you for sharing that, Beth. Very excited. Crystal is a friend, and she's somebody whose film I've seen a few times now. I hope others have as well. And this will be more or less a discussion of aftermath of what she's come to process as a result of making the film, and whether any of her thoughts have changed. So very much looking forward to that, and hope everyone can join us. And again, the other great events that come up every month or every couple of weeks that Beth mentioned at the beginning. So with this, we'll say goodbye for NAAP. Everyone can stay on the call for a minute here, and we'll see if there's any other Q&A. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Marianne. We really appreciate it.